Randolph Leggett didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he walked into a room, conversations died mid-sentence, and grown men found urgent reasons to study their shoes. He ruled Chicago's underworld with surgical precision, but there was one battle he was losing. You don't become the head of Chicago's most powerful crime family by showing weakness. Randolph Leggett understood this better than most. He'd eliminated threats, consolidated power, and built something that would outlast him. At least, that was the plan. But plans meant nothing when your 3-year-old son looked at the world like he was watching it through bulletproof glass, present but unreachable, silent as the grave. His 3-year-old son had never spoken a word. Allan had never cried, never laughed, never called for his father in the middle of the night. Doctors filled manila folders with phrases like developmental regression and trauma-induced mutism. Randolph burned every report. What did it matter what they called it? Allan's silence was louder than any scream, a living ghost of the car explosion that had stolen his mother 2 years earlier. That silence held an empire hostage until one November night at the Belladonna, when the most feared man in Chicago felt terror for the first time in 20 years. His son pointed a trembling finger at a waitress he'd never met and shattered the quiet with a single, impossible word. Mama. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get to the story. The Belladonna wasn't a restaurant where people came to eat. It was a proving ground disguised in velvet and candlelight, where senators broke bread with killers and fortunes changed hands over dessert. The maitre d' didn't check reservations. He checked names against a list that determined who lived and who became a cautionary tale. Elena Brooks tied her apron in the back kitchen, fingers fumbling with the strings. She'd been working at the Belladonna for 5 weeks, long enough to know the rules but not long enough to stop feeling like an imposter. The tips kept her studio apartment heated and her student loans from default. That was all that mattered. Elena, eyes up, hissed Marcus, the floor manager, a wiry man whose cologne couldn't quite mask the smell of nervous sweat. Table 12 just sat down. You take them. Do not engage unless spoken to. Do not linger. Do not make mistakes. Elena frowned, adjusting the collar of her white button-down shirt. Who is it? The governor? Marcus's face drained of color. Worse. Randolph Leggett. The kitchen went silent. The line cook stopped plating. The dishwasher's hands stilled in soapy water. Even the exhaust fans seemed to quiet. Everyone in Chicago knew that name, even if they pretended not to. Especially if they pretended not to. Randolph Leggett wasn't just Mafia. He was the machinery behind the curtain, the reason construction permits got approved or disappeared, the shadow that made prosecutors reconsider their careers. Widowed young. Ruthlessly private. Utterly untouchable. I'll take it, Elena heard herself say, though every survival instinct screamed to fake illness and leave through the service exit. But rent was due in 6 days, and pride was a luxury she'd stopped affording 2 years ago. She pushed through the double doors into the dining room. The atmosphere had changed. The usual low hum of conversation felt muted, strained, like everyone was holding their breath without realizing it. At table 12, positioned with a clear view of both entrances but hidden from the street-facing windows, sat a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and cruelty in equal measure. Randolph Leggett was 34, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elena made in 6 months. Dark hair threaded with premature silver. Sharp jawline. Eyes that moved across the room like a predator cataloging exits and threats. A thin scar bisected his left eyebrow, the only visible flaw in an otherwise controlled exterior. But Elena's attention snagged on something else entirely. The child. Sitting in a modified high chair beside the crime lord was a small boy, perhaps 3 years old. Dark curls fell across his forehead. He had his father's bone structure but softer, unfinished, with round cheeks and impossibly long lashes. He clutched a small wooden train in one hand, holding it with the careful intensity of someone who'd learned early that nothing was permanent. This was Allan Leggett. The silent heir. The tabloids called him the ghost child in the rare photos that surfaced, always blurred, always from a distance. Rumors said he'd never spoken. That the trauma of losing his mother had locked him in permanent silence. Elena approached the table, water pitcher steady in her hands despite her racing pulse. "Good evening, sir," she said, keeping her voice neutral and professional. "Still or sparkling water?" Randolph didn't look up from the leather-bound menu. "Sparkling. And warm milk for the boy. Not hot. Warm. Of course." As Elena leaned forward to pour water into the crystal glass, her wrist brushed the edge of the table. A faint scent rose from her skin, nothing expensive or deliberate, just the cheap lavender hand soap from the staff bathroom mixed with the vanilla lotion she'd used that morning. Randolph's hand stilled on the menu. His head lifted slowly, eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. For half a second, something flickered across his expression. Recognition. Confusion. Pain. It vanished before she could name it, replaced by the cold, flat stare of a man who'd perfected emotional lockdown decades ago. "Be quick," he said, voice low and edged with something she couldn't identify. Elena nodded and turned toward the child, forcing warmth into her smile despite the ice creeping up her spine. "And for you, sweetheart," she whispered, crouching slightly to meet the boy's eye level. That's when it happened. Allan's head turned. Slowly. Deliberately. His dark eyes, previously focused on some middle distance only he could see, locked onto Elena's face. The wooden train slipped from his fingers and clattered to the marble floor, the sound impossibly loud in the hushed room. Elena felt it like a physical blow. A jolt that started in her chest and radiated outward, a phantom ache she hadn't felt in 2 years. Not since the clinic. Not since the doctor's grim face and the paperwork she'd signed while barely conscious. Not since they'd told her the baby hadn't survived and that it was a mercy she hadn't held him. The boy's mouth opened. His bottom lip trembled. Tears pooled in those impossibly dark eyes. Randolph noticed immediately. His entire body tensed, leaning forward with the coiled energy of a man about to spring into action. "Allan," he said, voice dropping to something almost gentle, almost panicked. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" The child ignored his father completely. Small hands reached out, fingers grasping at Elena's apron, pulling with surprising strength. She stood frozen, the water pitcher trembling in her grip. She couldn't move. Couldn't think. Her body recognized something her mind refused to accept. Then Allan Leggett, who had never spoken a single word in his 3 years of life, opened his mouth and shattered the silence that had ruled his father's empire. "Mama." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Elena's vision blurred. The pitcher slipped from her hands, hitting the floor in an explosion of glass and ice water. Somewhere behind her, Marcus shouted. Chairs scraped. Guards moved toward the table. But all Elena could see was the child. The boy reaching for her with desperate certainty. The boy whose eyes held a recognition that shouldn't be possible. And all Randolph could see was the waitress whose face had gone white as death, whose hands were shaking, whose eyes held the same impossible recognition reflected in his son's. "Mama," Allan said again, louder now, tears streaming down his cheeks. Randolph Leggett rose slowly from his chair, and for the first time in 20 years, he didn't know what move to make next. The dining room had become a crime scene without a body. Marcus stood frozen by the kitchen doors, his face cycling through confusion, terror, and the dawning realization that he'd just witnessed something that could get him killed for knowing about it. The other diners had gone silent, silverware suspended mid-air, conversations dying in their throats. Even the piano player in the corner had stopped, his hands hovering over keys that suddenly seemed too loud to touch. Randolph's guards moved first. 2 men in dark suits materialized from their posts near the entrance, their movements fluid and practiced. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was a threat. Elena couldn't move. Allan's small hands were fisted in her apron, his face pressed against her stomach, his whole body shaking with sobs that sounded like they'd been buried for years. The weight of him against her felt wrong and right simultaneously, triggering something primal she'd spent 2 years trying to bury. "Miss Brooks." Randolph's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. His tone was perfectly controlled, which somehow made it more terrifying. We're going to move this conversation somewhere more private. You're going to come with us. Voluntarily. The last word carried the weight of a command disguised as a courtesy. Elena's throat felt like sandpaper. I don't understand what's happening. Neither do I. Randolph crouched beside his son, trying to gently pry the boy's fingers from Elena's apron. Allan, let go. We're taking her with us. She's not leaving. But Allan only gripped harder, his cries escalating to a pitch that made several diners wince. The sound was raw and desperate, the sound of a child who'd learned that letting go meant losing everything. Randolph's jaw tightened. He looked up at Elena, and she saw something flicker behind the ice in his eyes. Please. Don't fight this. If you run, he'll only get worse. It wasn't a threat. It was the closest thing to begging a man like Randolph Leggett probably knew how to articulate. Elena nodded slowly, her hands instinctively moving to rest on Allan's trembling shoulders. Okay, sweetheart, I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue because she had no idea if it was true. The car was a black Mercedes with windows tinted dark enough to be illegal. Elena sat in the back seat with Allan curled in her lap, his face buried in her shoulder, his small fists still clutching her uniform. He'd stopped crying but hadn't let go. Across from them, Randolph sat with his spine rigid, his eyes fixed on his son with an expression Elena couldn't read. The two guards sat in front, silent as statues. No one spoke during the 20-minute drive through Chicago's rain-slicked streets. Elena watched the city blur past through the tinted windows, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. Kidnapping, ransom, mistaken identity, human trafficking. Each possibility was worse than the last. But none of them explained why a 3-year-old boy she'd never met had called her mama with the certainty of someone recognizing home. The car turned through iron gates that opened automatically, rolling up a circular driveway toward an estate that looked like it belonged in a European postcard, not the outskirts of Chicago. Stone facade, manicured gardens, security cameras on every corner. The kind of place where screams got swallowed by wealth and distance. Elena's pulse hammered in her throat. She woke up disoriented, her neck stiff from an uncomfortable angle. The room around her was enormous, easily twice the size of her entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the gardens, though heavy curtains could be drawn for privacy. The bed she was sitting on felt like a cloud, covered in silk sheets in a deep charcoal gray. Abstract art hung on the walls, the kind that cost more than most people's cars. No windows that opened. No visible lock on the door, but Elena had no doubt it was secured from the outside. A gilded cage was still a cage. She didn't remember falling asleep. The last clear memory she had was sitting in a guest room while a stern-faced woman brought Allan his dinner, the boy refusing to eat unless Elena stayed within arm's reach. Somewhere between the fourth attempt to get him to try his vegetables and the soft lullaby she'd hummed without thinking, exhaustion had dragged her under. Now it was morning. Gray light filtered through the curtains. Her uniform had been replaced with clean clothes, simple but expensive, soft cotton pants and a sweater that fit perfectly. Someone had undressed her while she slept. The violation of it made her skin crawl. The door opened without a knock. Randolph Leggett stood in the doorway, showered and dressed in a fresh suit, looking like he'd slept 8 hours despite the chaos of the previous night. Behind him, a man in a white coat carried a leather medical bag. A doctor. Or someone pretending to be one. Good morning, Miss Brooks. Randolph's tone was cordial, almost pleasant, which made Elena's blood run cold. I trust you slept well. Where's Allan? Elena's voice came out hoarse. Safe. Federal. Still asking for you. Randolph stepped into the room, his movements deliberate and controlled. The doctor remained in the hallway. We need to talk. And you're going to answer my questions honestly, because your life and my son's well-being both depend on the truth. He gestured to a small sitting area by the window, 2 leather chairs facing each other across a glass coffee table. Elena had no choice but to sit. Randolph settled across from her, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp as broken glass. He placed a manila folder on the table between them. Elena Brooks, 25 years old. Graduated from Northwestern with a degree in early childhood education. Student loans totaling $63,000. Currently working 3 jobs to stay afloat. Parents deceased. No siblings. No close family. He opened the folder, revealing pages of documentation. His voice remained neutral, factual, like he was reading a grocery list. And 2 years ago, you gave birth at St. Mary's private medical wing. Elena's breath stopped. How do you know that? I own half the board of directors at St. Mary's. When my son displayed an impossible recognition of a stranger, I made phone calls. He leaned forward slightly. Tell me what happened that night. Elena's hands trembled in her lap. I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Elena's mind raced through options. Lie. Refuse. Demand a lawyer. But Allan's face kept appearing in her memory, those desperate eyes, that impossible word. Mama. I was 7 months pregnant, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. There were complications. Preeclampsia. They said I needed an emergency C-section or we'd both die. Go on. I went in alone. The father wasn't in the picture. I didn't have anyone else. Elena's throat tightened, the memories clawing their way to the surface despite 2 years of carefully constructed walls. When I woke up, the doctor told me the baby didn't make it. A boy. They said his lungs weren't developed enough. That he died within minutes. That it was a mercy I didn't have to watch. Did you hold him? No. Elena's voice cracked. They said it would be too traumatic. That I should remember him as a possibility, not a reality. I signed the paperwork. I left 3 days later. I never saw him. Never held him. Never even knew if he had all his fingers and toes. The tears came without permission, hot and bitter, carrying 2 years of grief that had never found proper release. Elena covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs she'd suppressed through sheer force of will and survival necessity. Randolph didn't move. Didn't offer comfort. Just watched with the cold calculation of a man assembling a puzzle from blood-stained pieces. When Elena finally looked up, her face blotchy and raw, Randolph was holding a different document. A birth certificate. My son was born the same night, he said quietly. Same hospital. Same private wing. My wife had been in labor for 18 hours. He paused, and for the first time, something human flickered across his expression. She died 2 hours after Allan was born. Hemorrhage. They tried to save her. I'm sorry, Elena whispered automatically. Don't be. Randolph's voice turned to steel. Because my wife was infertile. She couldn't carry a child. We'd tried for 3 years. Every specialist said the same thing. Impossible. He placed the birth certificate on the table, spinning it so Elena could read it. And yet, 2 hours before she died, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Elena stared at the document, her vision blurring. The timeline matched. The hospital matched. The weight of coincidence was crushing. Randolph leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. They lied to you, Miss Brooks. Your son didn't die. He was stolen. Given to a woman who couldn't have children but desperately wanted to secure her husband's legacy. He paused, letting the words sink in like poison. Allan isn't my wife's biological child. He's yours. The room tilted. Elena's hands gripped the armrests of the chair, her knuckles white. That's impossible. DNA doesn't lie. The doctor in the hallway is here to take samples from both you and Allan. By tomorrow morning, we'll have proof. But I already know the truth. Randolph stood, towering over her. My son recognized his own mother. Elena couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint. 2 years of grief. 2 years of believing her son was dead. 2 years of carrying phantom weight and ghost kicks and the emptiness of arms that never got to hold him. If this was true, if Allan was hers, then everything she'd survived had been a lie. And the people who'd orchestrated that lie had the power to make her disappear. Randolph watched her carefully, reading every micro-expression with the precision of a man who'd built an empire on knowing when people were lying. You have 2 choices, Miss Brooks. You can cooperate, submit to testing, and help me understand how this happened and who's responsible. Or you can refuse, and I'll assume you're part of whatever conspiracy buried my wife's infertility and stole a child to cover it up. Elena's head snapped up. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. I believe you. The admission seemed to cost him something. But belief doesn't equal trust. So you're going to stay here, under guard, until we have proof. And if that proof confirms what I already suspect, then you and I are going to have a very different conversation about who wanted my family to believe a lie, and what they were willing to do to maintain it. He walked to the door, then paused, looking back at her with something almost like pity. For what it's worth, Miss Brooks, I hope the DNA matches. Because if my son has finally found his real mother, then perhaps he can finally heal. And if you are his mother, then you deserve to know the truth about what was taken from you. The door closed with a soft click. Elena sat alone in the beautiful prison, her hands pressed against her stomach where phantom kicks still haunted her at night, and let herself consider the impossible. Allan was hers. And someone had stolen him. The envelope sat on Randolph's desk like a loaded gun. 24 hours had crawled past since the doctor took blood samples from Elena and Allan. 24 hours of Elena confined to the guest wing, watched by guards who brought her meals and clean clothes but no answers. 24 hours of Allan refusing to sleep unless Elena sang to him through the cracked door of his nursery, his small voice occasionally echoing back with fragments of words he'd never spoken before. Water. Please. Stay. Each word was a minor miracle and a major complication. Randolph stood at the window of his study, watching the November rain turn his gardens into impressionist paintings. Behind him, his head of security, Vincent Torres, waited in the kind of silence that preceded executions or revelations. The envelope remained sealed. Schrodinger's truth. As long as he didn't open it, both realities could exist simultaneously. But Randolph Leggett hadn't built an empire by avoiding uncomfortable truths. He picked up the envelope, slid his finger under the seal, and extracted the single sheet of laboratory letterhead. His eyes scanned the technical language, the genetic markers, the percentage that sat at the bottom like a judge's gavel. Probability of maternity, 99.97%. Vincent cleared his throat. Sir. It's confirmed. Randolph's voice was flat, emotionless, though his hand tightened on the paper until it crumpled slightly. Elena Brooks is Allan's biological mother. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Not of Elena. Of everyone else. Randolph turned, his mind already racing through implications like bullets through a chamber. My wife lied to me. The doctors lied to me. Someone orchestrated an illegal adoption, falsified birth records, and let a grieving woman believe her child was dead. He set the paper down carefully, his movements controlled despite the rage building beneath his skin. I want to know who. I want names. I want bank records. I want every person who was in that medical wing the night Allan was born, and I want to know which of them sold my son. Vincent nodded, already pulling out his phone. And the woman. Randolph paused, considering. Bring her to my study. It's time she knew the truth. Elena had stopped counting the tiles on the ceiling around 3 in the morning. Now, with gray daylight filtering through the curtains, she sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. Her mind kept replaying that moment in the belladonna. Allan's hands reaching for her. That word. Mama. She'd spent 2 years constructing a life around a hole shaped like the sun she'd lost. Now someone was telling her the hole was a lie, and the sun was real, and everything she'd grieved was stolen rather than lost. The door opened. A different guard this time, younger, with a face that suggested he'd been hired for intimidation rather than conversation. Mr. Leggett wants to see you. Elena's stomach dropped. She followed him through hallways that could have been in a museum, past artwork that cost more than her education, down a sweeping staircase, and finally to a heavy oak door. The guard knocked twice, then opened it without waiting for a response. Randolph sat behind a massive desk that looked like it had witnessed decades of decisions that shaped Chicago's underworld. He wasn't alone. A man in his 50s stood near the window, military bearing, watchful eyes. Vincent, Elena guessed. The kind of man who made problems disappear. Sit, Miss Brooks. Randolph gestured to the leather chair across from him. Elena sat, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. She noticed the paper on his desk immediately. Laboratory letterhead. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. Randolph slid the document across the polished wood. Read it yourself. Elena's hands trembled as she picked up the paper. The technical language blurred together until her eyes found the conclusion. 99.97% probability of maternity. Her vision swam. The paper slipped from her fingers, drifting back to the desk. He's mine, she whispered. Allan is my son. Yes. Randolph's voice was carefully neutral. Which means someone at St. Mary's private medical wing conspired to fake your son's death, falsify adoption records, and deliver a stolen child to my wife. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. I need you to remember everything about that night. Every detail. Every face. Every conversation. Elena's mind was reeling, trying to reconcile 2 years of grief with this impossible truth. I told you everything. The doctor said my son died. I never held him. They made me sign papers before they'd release me. The doctor's name. Elena closed her eyes, digging through memories she'd tried so hard to bury. Dr. Harrison. Michael Harrison. He had gray hair and glasses. He barely looked at me when he delivered the news. Vincent made a note on his phone. Randolph's expression darkened. Michael Harrison disappeared 18 months ago. Moved to the Cayman Islands. His bank accounts showed a deposit of $500,000 the week after Allan was born. He paused, letting that information settle like sediment in dark water. Someone paid him to lie to you and deliver your son to my wife. But why? Elena's voice broke. Why steal a baby when you could just arrange a legal adoption? Because my wife was desperate to secure the Leggett legacy. Randolph stood, pacing to the window. She couldn't have children. Every specialist confirmed it. But in my world, weakness is death. A wife who couldn't produce an heir was a vulnerability. She needed a child to secure her position, to guarantee her safety. He turned back, his expression carved from granite. So she bought one. Elena felt bile rise in her throat. She bought my son. And let you believe he was dead. Randolph's voice carried the weight of his own betrayal. I loved my wife, Miss Brooks. But I'm beginning to understand I never truly knew her. The nursery was painted in soft blues and grays, with toys organized on shelves that Allan rarely touched. He sat in the middle of a plush rug, his wooden train clutched in one hand, staring at the door like he'd been waiting. When Elena entered, his entire face transformed. Mama. The word came easier now, less like a question and more like a statement of fact. He scrambled to his feet, running to her with the unsteady gait of a toddler who'd recently learned that trust was dangerous. Elena dropped to her knees, catching him as he crashed into her arms. The weight of him, the warmth, the realness of holding her son for the first time since he'd been cut from her body. It shattered something inside her chest. Tears streamed down her face as she held him, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and something indefinably him. I'm here, sweetheart. Mama's here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Allan pulled back, his small hands framing her wet face. Not sad, he said carefully, each word deliberate. Mama here now. Elena laughed through her tears, a sound somewhere between joy and breaking. Yes, baby. Mama's here now. Over the next hours, she watched Allan transform. The silent, hollow child from the restaurant was gone. In his place was a little boy discovering his voice. He pointed at toys and named them. Book, bear, train. When Elena read to him, he repeated words, testing them out like new clothes. When she sang, he hummed along, his pitch uncertain but earnest. At dinner, Randolph watched from the doorway as Allan sat in Elena's lap, finally eating vegetables because she made them into a game. The child who'd barely tolerated solid food for months ate everything on his plate, then asked for more. More, please, Allan said, and Randolph felt something crack in his chest that had nothing to do with business or legacy. This was what healing looked like. Marcus Leggett received the message at midnight. A single text from an encrypted number. 3 words that changed everything. The mother lives. He stood on the balcony of his penthouse, overlooking the Chicago skyline, and calculated how much time he had before his carefully constructed plans collapsed. He'd paid Harrison. He'd ensured the paperwork was perfect. He'd watched his cousin's wife die in childbirth and seen an opportunity to secure his own eventual ascension. If Randolph discovered Allan was illegitimate, not just adopted, but stolen, the family would fracture. The old guard would demand accountability. Marcus would step forward as the stable choice, the legitimate heir. But if Elena Brooks lived long enough to tell her story, everything burned. Marcus made 2 phone calls. The first was to a contractor in Gary, Indiana. The second was to a family lawyer who specialized in emergencies. By dawn, pieces would be moving. The shot came at 7:43 in the morning. Elena was reading to Allan by the nursery window, sunlight streaming across the pages of a picture book about trains. Allan sat in her lap, his finger tracing the illustrations, his voice stumbling over bigger words. "Choo-choo goes fast," he said proudly. "So fast," Elena agreed, kissing the top of his head. The window exploded inward in a spray of glass and morning light. Elena's instincts moved faster than conscious thought. She threw herself sideways, covering Allan's body with her own as they hit the floor. Shards of glass rained down like frozen rain. Allan screamed, a sound of terror rather than pain, and Elena pressed him close, shielding his head with her arms. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. The door burst open. Randolph appeared, gun drawn, Vincent right behind him. 2 more guards flooded past them, weapons raised, scanning the room. Elena didn't move. Couldn't move. Allan was screaming, his small body shaking against hers, and all she could do was whisper soothing nonsense into his hair. "You're safe. Mama's got you. You're safe." Randolph crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside them. "Are you hurt?" Elena shook her head, finally sitting up but keeping Allan clutched against her chest. "He's okay. We're okay." Vincent appeared at the window, examining the hole punched through the glass. "Sniper. Long range. Probably from the building across the park." His voice was clinical, professional. "Missed by inches. Not a miss." Randolph's voice was deadly quiet. "A message." He looked at Elena, at his son clinging to her like a lifeline, and made a decision that would reshape his empire. "You're not leaving," he said flatly. "Not until we find who ordered this. Not until they're dealt with. Allan needs you, and apparently, someone wants you dead." He stood, his expression carved from iron. "You stay under my protection." "That's not a request." Elena met his eyes, seeing the calculation behind them. She was a target now. A loose end. A threat to someone powerful enough to arrange sniper fire into one of Chicago's most secure estates. But she was also a mother who'd just found her stolen son. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, her hand stroking Allan's trembling back. "Not without him." Randolph nodded once, then turned to Vincent. "Lock down the estate. No one in or out without my explicit approval. And find me Marcus." Vincent's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "You think it's internal?" "I think my son was stolen to secure a legacy." Randolph's voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. And I think whoever arranged that theft just tried to eliminate the one person who could expose them. He looked back at Elena, at Allan finally quieting in her arms, and felt the ground shift beneath his empire. Someone in his family had declared war. And they'd just made their first mistake. The dress cost more than Elena had made in her entire year at the Belladonna. Midnight blue silk that moved like water, custom tailored to fit her frame perfectly despite the measurements being taken only 48 hours earlier. The stylist had transformed her hair from a simple ponytail into an elegant updo that exposed the column of her neck. Diamond earrings, borrowed, she was told, though she suspected they were bought, caught the light every time she moved. Elena barely recognized herself in the mirror. "You look beautiful," the stylist said with professional satisfaction. "Mr. Leggett will be pleased." Elena didn't care what Randolph thought. She cared that Allan was being left behind with armed guards while she played dress-up in a war she didn't understand. But Randolph had made his position clear during their briefing that morning. "Marcus needs to see you. Needs to believe you're under my control, that you're not a threat." Randolph had paced his study like a caged predator while Vincent pulled up surveillance photos on a tablet. The Children's Hospital Charity Gala is the perfect stage. Half of Chicago's elite will be there. Marcus can't make a move without witnesses. We draw him out, we watch his reactions, and we figure out who else is involved. And Allan? Elena had asked, her voice tight. "Stays here. Under guard. Non-negotiable." Now, standing in the guest room wearing a fortune in silk and jewelry, Elena felt like a chess piece being moved into position by players who understood the game far better than she did. The door opened without a knock. Randolph entered, and for a moment, something flickered across his expression before the mask of control slammed back into place. He wore a tuxedo that made him look like he'd stepped out of a different century, all sharp lines and deadly elegance. A single platinum cufflink caught the light. His hair was styled back, revealing the scar through his eyebrow that somehow made him more dangerous rather than less. "You'll do," he said, his tone neutral. "High praise," Elena replied dryly. The corner of his mouth twitched. Almost a smile. "You need to understand something before we leave. Tonight, you're not Elena Brooks, struggling waitress. You're under my protection, which means you're untouchable." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "But it also means every word you say, every expression you make, will be analyzed by people who've spent their lives reading weakness. Don't give them any." "I'm not weak." "No." Randolph held her gaze. "You're a mother who just found her stolen son. That makes you the most dangerous person in the room. Use it." The grand ballroom of the Palmer House was a cathedral of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors. String quartets played in corners while servers in white gloves circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more per bite than Elena's hourly wage. Women dripped in jewels. Men wore influence like cologne. Elena entered on Randolph's arm, feeling every eye in the room track their arrival. The whispers started immediately. Hushed speculation masked behind polite smiles. Randolph Leggett, the city's most eligible and dangerous widower, arriving with an unknown woman. The gossip would fuel society pages for weeks. Which was exactly the point. Randolph's hand rested lightly on her lower back, a gesture that appeared protective but was really control. Steering her through the crowd. Positioning her. Playing the game. They made it halfway across the ballroom before Marcus found them. "Cousin." Marcus Leggett approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was in his late 30s, handsome in a polished way that suggested expensive grooming rather than natural genetics. Silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples. His tuxedo was impeccable. His handshake was too firm. "I didn't expect to see you here. You've been so reclusive since the incident." The incident. As if a sniper shot through a nursery window was a minor social inconvenience. "Things change," Randolph replied evenly. "Marcus, this is Elena Brooks. She's been helping with Allan's development." Marcus's gaze slid to Elena, his assessment clinical and invasive. She felt stripped bare under his scrutiny, like he was calculating her value and finding her lacking. "How generous of you," Marcus said smoothly. "Taking in strays. Though I have to wonder about the security implications." His smile sharpened. "Given recent events." Elena felt Randolph tense beside her, a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release. But she spoke before he could. "Allan's well-being is the only security that matters," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Everything else is just noise." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. "She speaks. How refreshing." He turned back to Randolph. "We should talk. Business. Privately. Later." Randolph's tone left no room for negotiation. "Right now, we're here to support the hospital. I've made a donation in Allan's name. $500,000 for the children's wing." The number hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before recovering. "How charitable." Though one wonders if the hospital administration knows about the source of such generosity. "They know exactly who I am." Randolph's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Just as they know exactly who you are, cousin. We all have skeletons. The question is who's willing to dig them up." The threat was barely veiled. Marcus's jaw tightened, but his smile never wavered. "Enjoy the party," he said, raising his champagne glass in mock salute before disappearing back into the crowd. Elena released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "He knows. Of course he knows." Randolph's hand pressed more firmly against her back, guiding her toward a quieter corner. "The question is how much, and who told him." He scanned the room, cataloging faces, reading alliances. "Vincent is tracking his movements. We'll know everyone he talks to tonight." "Not a miss." Randolph's voice was deadly quiet. "A message." He looked at Elena, at his son clinging to her like a lifeline, and made a decision that would reshape his empire. "You're not leaving," he said flatly. "Not until we find who ordered this. Not until they're dealt with. Allan needs you, and apparently, someone wants you dead." He stood, his expression carved from iron. "You stay under my protection." "That's not a request." Elena met his eyes, seeing the calculation behind them. She was a target now. A loose end. A threat to someone powerful enough to arrange sniper fire into one of Chicago's most secure estates. But she was also a mother who'd just found her stolen son. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, her hand stroking Allan's trembling back. "Not without him." Randolph nodded once, then turned to Vincent. "Lock down the estate. No one in or out without my explicit approval. And find me Marcus." Vincent's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "You think it's internal?" "I think my son was stolen to secure a legacy." Randolph's voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "And I think whoever arranged that theft just tried to eliminate the one person who could expose them." He looked back at Elena, at Allan finally quieting in her arms, and felt the ground shift beneath his empire. Someone in his family had declared war. And they'd just made their first mistake. The dress cost more than Elena had made in her entire year at the Belladonna. Midnight blue silk that moved like water, custom tailored to fit her frame perfectly despite the measurements being taken only 48 hours earlier. The stylist had transformed her hair from a simple ponytail into an elegant updo that exposed the column of her neck. Diamond earrings, borrowed, she was told, though she suspected they were bought, caught the light every time she moved. Elena barely recognized herself in the mirror. "You look beautiful," the stylist said with professional satisfaction. "Mr. Leggett will be pleased." Elena didn't care what Randolph thought. She cared that Allan was being left behind with armed guards while she played dress-up in a war she didn't understand. But Randolph had made his position clear during their briefing that morning. "Marcus needs to see you. Needs to believe you're under my control, that you're not a threat." Randolph had paced his study like a caged predator while Vincent pulled up surveillance photos on a tablet. The Children's Hospital Charity Gala is the perfect stage. Half of Chicago's elite will be there. Marcus can't make a move without witnesses. We draw him out, we watch his reactions, and we figure out who else is involved. And Allan, Elena had asked, her voice tight, stays here. Under guard. Non-negotiable. Now, standing in the guest room wearing a fortune in silk and jewelry, Elena felt like a chess piece being moved into position by players who understood the game far better than she did. The door opened without a knock. Randolph entered, and for a moment, something flickered across his expression before the mask of control slammed back into place. He wore a tuxedo that made him look like he'd stepped out of a different century, all sharp lines and deadly elegance. A single platinum cufflink caught the light. His hair was styled back, revealing the scar through his eyebrow that somehow made him more dangerous rather than less. You'll do, he said, his tone neutral. High praise, Elena replied dryly. The corner of his mouth twitched. Almost a smile. You need to understand something before we leave. Tonight, you're not Elena Brooks, struggling waitress. You're under my protection, which means you're untouchable. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. But it also means every word you say, every expression you make, will be analyzed by people who've spent their lives reading weakness. Don't give them any. I'm not weak. No. Randolph held her gaze. You're a mother who just found her stolen son. That makes you the most dangerous person in the room. Use it. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House was a cathedral of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors. String quartets played in corners while servers in white gloves circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more per bite than Elena's hourly wage. Women dripped in jewels. Men wore influence like cologne. Elena entered on Randolph's arm, feeling every eye in the room track their arrival. The whispers started immediately. Hushed speculation masked behind polite smiles. Randolph Leggett, the city's most eligible and dangerous widower, arriving with an unknown woman. The gossip would fuel society pages for weeks. Which was exactly the point. Randolph's hand rested lightly on her lower back, a gesture that appeared protective but was really control. Steering her through the crowd. Positioning her. Playing the game. They made it halfway across the ballroom before Marcus found them. Cousin. Marcus Leggett approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was in his late 30s, handsome in a polished way that suggested expensive grooming rather than natural genetics. Silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples. His tuxedo was impeccable. His handshake was too firm. I didn't expect to see you here. You've been so reclusive since the incident. The incident. As if a sniper shot through a nursery window was a minor social inconvenience. Things change, Randolph replied evenly. Marcus, this is Elena Brooks. She's been helping with Allan's development. Marcus's gaze slid to Elena, his assessment clinical and invasive. She felt stripped bare under his scrutiny, like he was calculating her value and finding her lacking. How generous of you, Marcus said smoothly. Taking in strays. Though I have to wonder about the security implications. His smile sharpened. Given recent events. Elena felt Randolph tense beside her, a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release. But she spoke before he could. Allan's well-being is the only security that matters, she said, her voice calm and clear. Everything else is just noise. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. She speaks. How refreshing. He turned back to Randolph. We should talk. Business. Privately. Later. Randolph's tone left no room for negotiation. Right now, we're here to support the hospital. I've made a donation in Allan's name. $500,000 for the children's wing. The number hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before recovering. How charitable. Though one wonders if the hospital administration knows about the source of such generosity. They know exactly who I am. Randolph's voice dropped to something dangerous. Just as they know exactly who you are, cousin. We all have skeletons. The question is who's willing to dig them up. The threat was barely veiled. Marcus's jaw tightened, but his smile never wavered. Enjoy the party, he said, raising his champagne glass in mock salute before disappearing back into the crowd. Elena released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. He knows. Of course he knows. Randolph's hand pressed more firmly against her back, guiding her toward a quieter corner. The question is how much, and who told him. He scanned the room, cataloging faces, reading alliances. Vincent is tracking his movements. We'll know everyone he talks to tonight. The evening crawled past in a performance of normalcy. Randolph introduced Elena to politicians and business owners, each interaction a careful dance of revelation and concealment. She was his son's nanny, his consultant, his guest. Never anything more specific. Never anything that could be used against them. Elena played her role with surprising skill, smiling politely while her mind raced. She watched Marcus across the room, noting how certain people gravitated toward him. How others avoided him. The subtle nods. The brief conversations near the bar. The woman in the red dress who passed him something small enough to hide in a closed fist. Randolph, she murmured during a lull in conversation. The woman in red. 10 o'clock. He followed her gaze without moving his head. Good eye. That's Sophia Chen. Family lawyer. Why would your cousin need a lawyer at a charity gala? Why indeed? Randolph's expression remained neutral, but Elena felt the tension coil through his frame. Excuse me a moment. Stay where Vincent can see you. He disappeared into the crowd. Elena stood alone near a marble column, acutely aware of how exposed she was. Her hand instinctively moved to her clutch, as if the small beaded purse could offer any protection in a room full of Chicago's most dangerous power brokers. That's when her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, a burner device Vincent had given her for emergencies only. A single text message from an unknown number. Ask Randolph about the insurance policy. Ask him who benefited when his wife died. Elena's blood went cold. She looked up, scanning the crowd, trying to identify who might have sent it. But everyone looked the same. Smiling faces. Expensive clothes. Secrets hidden behind champagne glasses. Her phone buzzed again. He's not protecting you. He's protecting his empire. You're just convenient. Before she could process the implications, Vincent appeared at her elbow, his expression grim. We need to leave. Now. What happened? Vincent's jaw tightened. The estate's been breached. Armed intruders. They bypassed the perimeter security. Elena's entire world narrowed to a single point of terror. Allan. We have to go back, she said, her voice rising despite her attempt at control. We have to go now. Vincent was already moving, one hand on his earpiece, relaying orders to his team. Where's Randolph? Elena demanded. Handling Marcus. Vincent's grip on her arm was firm but not painful as he guided her toward a side exit. We've got a car waiting. 3-minute ETA to the estate. 3 minutes felt like 3 lifetimes. They moved through the service corridors, past startled catering staff, and burst into the cold November night. The black Mercedes was already running, rear door open. Elena dove inside, Vincent sliding in beside her as the driver peeled away from the curb. Status on the child, Vincent barked into his phone. A pause. His expression went carefully blank. Vincent, Elena's voice cracked. Where is my son? He lowered the phone slowly, and Elena saw something she hadn't thought possible in a man like Vincent Torres. Fear. He's gone. The guards are down. Non-lethal, but unconscious. They took Allan. The world stopped. Elena's vision tunneled, her ears ringing like someone had detonated a bomb inside her skull. She'd found her son 3 days ago. 3 days of holding him, hearing him speak, watching him smile. 3 days of reclaiming what had been stolen. And now he was gone again. No. The word came out broken, barely human. No, no, no. The car accelerated through red lights, Vincent shouting coordinates to the driver. Behind them, another vehicle pulled out, Randolph's chase car, she realized distantly. He'd been alerted. He was coming. But it didn't matter how fast they drove. Marcus had made his move while they'd been playing dress-up at a charity gala. And he'd taken the only thing that mattered. Elena pressed her hand against the window, watching Chicago blur past, and felt something inside her transform. The grief. The fear. The helplessness that had defined her for 2 years. It burned away, replaced by something colder. Clearer. Deadly. She'd lost Allan once because she'd been powerless. Uninformed. Alone. Not anymore. When the car screeched to a halt in front of the Leggett estate, Elena was already moving. She didn't wait for Vincent. Didn't wait for Randolph's arrival. She ran through the front door, taking the stairs 2 at a time, her heels abandoned somewhere in the foyer. The nursery door hung open. The room was destroyed. Furniture overturned. The window, replaced after the sniper attack, was shattered again. Glass everywhere. Allan's wooden train lay broken on the floor, split cleanly in half. 2 guards were slumped against the wall, breathing but unconscious. A dart protruded from one man's neck. Professional. Efficient. This wasn't random violence. This was a surgical extraction. Elena stood in the center of the wreckage, her expensive dress covered in glass dust, and felt every carefully constructed wall she'd built around her trauma collapse. She'd found her son. And monsters had stolen him again. Behind her, footsteps. Randolph appeared in the doorway, his tuxedo jacket gone, his shirt partially unbuttoned, his expression carved from murder and ice. Their eyes met across the destroyed nursery. And in that moment, they weren't captor and captive. Mob boss and waitress. Enemies forced into alliance. They were 2 parents whose child had been taken. And God help whoever had made that mistake. Vincent was already on his phone, barking orders into the encrypted line. Thermal imaging. Satellite feeds. Every traffic camera within a 5-mile radius. His team moved with military precision, but Elena could see the calculation in his eyes. Time was bleeding away, and they had no trail. Randolph stood motionless in the center of the destroyed nursery, his expression unreadable. But Elena had learned to read the micro-movements. The way his jaw tightened. The deliberate control of his breathing. The absolute stillness that preceded violence. He's still in the city, Randolph said quietly. Marcus doesn't have the infrastructure to move a child out of Chicago without triggering alerts. He paused, his eyes scanning the wreckage. He wants me to find him. A trap, Vincent said flatly. Obviously. Randolph picked up the broken halves of Allan's wooden train, his fingers tightening around the splintered wood. But he's miscalculated. He thinks I'll come alone. That pride or strategy will make me play by rules. His eyes met Elena's across the room, and she saw something shift behind the ice. He doesn't understand what it means to be a parent. Elena's phone buzzed. The burner device. She pulled it from her clutch with trembling hands. A video file. No message. She pressed play. The screen showed a rooftop at night. Wind whipped through the frame. Chicago's skyline glittered in the background, lights reflecting off the lake. The camera panned, and Elena's heart stopped. Allan stood at the edge of a rooftop helipad, his small hand gripped in Marcus's much larger one. The boy's face was tear-streaked but defiant. He wasn't screaming. Wasn't begging. Just staring at the camera with those impossibly old eyes. Marcus's voice came through the speaker, smooth and controlled. Cousin. I assume you've found my gift by now. I'm at the Meridian building. Top floor. You know the one, where father used to conduct his more delicate business before you forced him into retirement. He shifted, pulling Allan closer to the edge. The wind caught the boy's hair. Come alone. No Vincent. No cavalry. Just you. And bring the woman. She deserves to watch. The video ended. Elena's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. Randolph took it from her, watched the footage once, then handed it to Vincent. The Meridian building, Vincent confirmed, already pulling up schematics on his tablet. 42 stories. Rooftop helipad. 3 stairwell accesses, 2 elevator banks. He can see anyone approaching from every angle. Then we don't approach. Randolph's voice was deadly calm. We give him exactly what he wants. Sir, Vincent started. He wants a public execution. Randolph cut him off. He wants to force me to choose between my empire and my son, broadcast it to whatever allies he's cultivated, and step into the power vacuum when I'm destroyed. His expression hardened. So we let him believe he's won. The Meridian building was a glass and steel monument to old money, built by Randolph's father 3 decades earlier. It housed law firms, investment banks, and on the top floor, a private members club where Chicago's elite conducted business that never appeared in official records. The lobby was empty at this hour. Security cameras had been disabled. Marcus's work, clearly. Randolph and Elena entered through the front doors, no pretense of stealth. Vincent and his team were positioned 3 blocks away, waiting for the signal. The plan was simple, brutal, and carried a high probability of everyone dying. Elena had stopped caring about her own survival somewhere between the estate and the car ride here. They took the elevator. 42 floors of silence, the only sound the mechanical hum of cables and the thundering of Elena's heartbeat. She'd changed out of the evening gown into dark tactical clothing Vincent had provided. Her hair was pulled back. No jewelry. No illusions. Just a mother walking into hell to get her son back. The elevator doors opened onto a service corridor. Wind howled through an open door at the end of the hall, rooftop access. Randolph moved first, his gun drawn but held low. Elena followed, her own weapon, given to her by Vincent with a 5-minute crash course, feeling foreign and terrible in her grip. They emerged onto the rooftop. The helipad was a circle of painted concrete, landing lights dark, the city spreading out below them like a kingdom of glass and ambition. The wind was vicious this high up, tearing at their clothes, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust from the streets far below. Marcus stood in the center of the helipad, Allan held in front of him like a shield. The boy was alive. Awake. His eyes found Elena immediately, and his small mouth opened. Mama. The word broke something in Elena's chest. She started forward instinctively, but Randolph's hand shot out, gripping her arm. Not yet. Marcus smiled. How touching. The prodigal mother and the reluctant father, united in their devotion. He adjusted his grip on Allan, and Elena saw the gun in his other hand. Small caliber. Easily concealed. Pointed at the sky but capable of changing direction in a heartbeat. Let him go, Randolph said, his voice carrying over the wind. This is between us. Is it? Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. You built an empire on our family's foundation and called it vision. You pushed father aside and called it evolution. You married a desperate woman and accepted a stolen child as your heir, and you never questioned where he came from. His expression twisted. You were always so certain of your control, cousin. But you built your legacy on lies. Allan whimpered, trying to pull away from Marcus's grip. The man's hand tightened, and the boy cried out in pain. Elena's vision went red. Every maternal instinct she'd been denied for 2 years flooded her system like adrenaline. She moved before thought, 3 steps forward before Randolph could stop her. You're hurting him, she said, her voice cutting through the wind like broken glass. Marcus's attention shifted to her, and his smile widened. The infamous Elena Brooks. Do you know what you've cost me? My cousin's wife paid Harrison $500,000 to deliver her a healthy baby boy. I facilitated the transaction. I ensured the paperwork was perfect. I even arranged for the good doctor's comfortable retirement. His expression darkened. And then you had to survive. Had to stumble into the belladonna. Had to make a ghost child speak. You stole my son, Elena said, each word deliberate and cold. You let me believe he was dead. You took 2 years of his life from me. I took nothing. Marcus pulled Allan closer to the edge of the helipad. The drop behind them was 42 stories of empty air and concrete finality. Your son was always meant to secure the Leggett legacy. You were just unfortunate collateral damage. Randolph moved then, circling slowly, trying to position himself for a clear shot. But Marcus tracked him, using Allan as cover, always keeping the child between himself and any potential threat. Stop moving, cousin, Marcus warned. Or I drop him. Simple as that. You won't. Randolph's voice carried absolute certainty. He's your leverage. Without him, you're just a traitor with nowhere to run. Am I? Marcus's smile turned vicious. I have offshore accounts, new identities, and a dozen family allies who are tired of your progressive policies diluting our traditions. With you dead and the bastard child gone, I become the legitimate heir. The old guard will rally behind me. His finger tightened on the trigger. All I need is for you to make the wrong choice. He shifted, holding Allan over the edge. The boy's feet dangled above nothing, held only by Marcus's grip on his small arm. Allan's scream cut through the wind, raw and terrified. Choose, Marcus commanded. Step off the edge yourself, or I let go. Your life for his. Your empire for your son. Randolph didn't hesitate. He holstered his weapon, raised his hands, and walked toward the edge of the helipad. His expression was calm, almost peaceful. The mask had finally fallen away, revealing something Elena had never expected to see in a man like Randolph Leggett. Acceptance. Love. Sacrifice. Done, Randolph said simply. Let him go, and I'll jump. No. Elena's voice cracked. Randolph, don't. But he'd already reached the edge, standing 3 feet from Marcus and Allan, staring down at 42 stories of empty air. He looked back at Elena once, and something passed between them. Understanding. Permission. Trust. Take care of him, Randolph said quietly. Then he stepped off the edge. Marcus's eyes widened in shock. For half a second, his attention wavered, his grip on Allan loosening as he tried to process what he'd just witnessed. That was all Elena needed. She didn't think. Didn't calculate. Just moved with the pure, blind instinct of a mother who'd already lost her child once and would burn the world down before it happened again. She dove forward, her hands outstretched, reaching for Allan as Marcus's grip faltered. Her fingers closed around the boy's wrist just as Marcus realized his mistake and tried to compensate. But momentum and desperation gave Elena strength she didn't know she possessed. She yanked Allan away from the edge, falling backward, tucking the boy against her chest as they hit the concrete. Allan's scream transformed into sobs, his small body shaking against hers. Mama, 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 he chanted, the words tumbling out between gasps. Mama here. Don't leave. Mama stay. I'm here, baby, Elena sobbed, her hands running over him frantically, checking for injuries. I've got you. Mama's got you. I'm never letting go. Marcus's roar of rage cut through the moment. He raised his gun, aiming at Elena and Allan, his face twisted with fury. You stupid. The shot came from the shadows near the rooftop access door. Randolph stood there, his clothing torn from where he'd caught himself on the emergency ladder 2 feet below the edge of the helipad. His gun was raised. His aim was perfect. The bullet caught Marcus in the center of his chest. The man stumbled backward, his expression shifting from rage to surprise to nothing at all. He teetered at the edge of the helipad for a moment that stretched into eternity. Then gravity claimed what violence had prepared. Marcus Leggett fell without a sound, disappearing into the darkness below. The silence that followed was deafening. Randolph crossed the helipad, his steps measured and controlled despite what he'd just done. He holstered his weapon, then knelt beside Elena and Allan. The boy was still sobbing, his face buried in Elena's shoulder, his small hands fisted in her tactical shirt. Is he hurt? Randolph asked quietly. Elena shook her head, her own tears streaming freely now. No. He's okay. We're okay. Allan lifted his head, his face red and tear-streaked but his eyes clear. His gaze moved between Elena and Randolph, recognition and relief flooding his expression. Mama saved me, he said, his voice stronger than Elena had ever heard it. And Daddy came back. The word hit Randolph like a physical blow. His composure cracked, just for a moment, revealing the man beneath the monster. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering near Allan's tear-stained cheek. "Always," he said, his voice rough. "I will always come back for you." Allan reached out, his small hand grasping Randolph's much larger one. The three of them stayed there, kneeling on the concrete while the wind howled and sirens began to wail in the distance far below. Vincent's voice crackled through Randolph's earpiece. "Police are 2 minutes out. We need to move." But for that moment, none of them moved. Elena held her son. Randolph held his family. And 42 stories below, Chicago's underworld shifted on its axis, reorganizing around the truth that had just been written in blood and sacrifice on a rooftop under a cold November sky. Randolph Leggett had chosen his son over his empire. And in doing so, he'd revealed the only real power that mattered. The empire would survive. It would change, restructure, adapt. Allies would become enemies. Enemies would become ghosts. But the family, this strange, stolen, reclaimed family, would endure. Because some bonds weren't forged in blood or law. They were forged in sacrifice, in choice, in the willingness to step off the edge of everything for the people who mattered most. Elena looked up at Randolph, still kneeling beside them, and saw the truth reflected in his eyes. They weren't captor and victim anymore. They were partners in survival. And together, they would protect what had been stolen and reclaimed. No matter the cost. The investigation into Marcus Leggett's death was ruled self-defense within 72 hours. 6 witnesses, including 3 off-duty police officers attending the charity gala, confirmed that Marcus had orchestrated the kidnapping. Security footage from the Meridian building showed him holding a child over a fatal drop. Ballistics matched the weapon found near his body to 2 unsolved homicides from the previous year. The case closed quietly, efficiently, the way cases involving the Leggett family always did. But the real reckoning happened behind closed doors. Randolph sat in his study for 3 days straight, meeting with lawyers, accountants, and the family's oldest allies. Vincent stood guard while conversations that would reshape Chicago's underworld took place in measured tones over glasses of whiskey that went untouched. Elena watched from the doorway once, seeing Randolph sign documents that dissolved shell companies, severed ties with politicians whose loyalty had proven negotiable, and restructured his empire into something smaller, cleaner, and infinitely more defensible. He was burning it down. Not completely. But enough that the old guard would understand the message. Some things were no longer for sale. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the estate on a cold December morning, her credentials vetted by Vincent's team and her reputation as a pediatric trauma specialist preceding her. She was in her 40s, warm but professional, with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to be easily fooled. Allan sat on Elena's lap in the drawing room, his small hands playing with a new wooden train Randolph had commissioned, identical to the one broken on the rooftop, but somehow different now. A replacement. A fresh start. Dr. Chen spoke to Allan for an hour while Elena and Randolph watched from across the room. The psychologist asked simple questions, used play therapy techniques, and never pushed when Allan went quiet. But the boy who had been silent for 3 years was finding his voice in ways that astonished everyone. He pointed at pictures and named them. Dog. House. Family. He told fragmented stories about the rooftop, processing the trauma in pieces small enough to hold. He asked questions. Why did Uncle Marcus want to hurt us? Where did he go? Is he coming back? Elena answered with age-appropriate honesty, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled. No, sweetheart. He's not coming back. He made very bad choices, and now he can't hurt anyone anymore. You and Daddy stopped him, Allan said with the confidence of a child whose world had been violently shaken but ultimately righted. You saved me. We did, Elena confirmed, meeting Randolph's eyes across the room. We saved each other. After the session, Dr. Chen pulled them aside while Allan played under Vincent's watchful supervision. He's remarkably resilient, the psychologist said, reviewing her notes. The selective mutism was trauma-induced, but now that he feels safe, his language development is accelerating rapidly. He'll need ongoing therapy, structure, and consistency. She paused, looking between Elena and Randolph. But more than anything, he needs what you're already giving him. Security. Love. Parents who show up. Randolph nodded once, his expression unreadable. How long until he's fully recovered? Dr. Chen smiled gently. That's not really how trauma works, Mr. Leggett. He'll carry this with him. But with the right support, it doesn't have to define him. She closed her folder. I'd like to see him twice a week for the next 3 months, then reassess. And I'd recommend family therapy as well. All 3 of you together. Elena's breath caught. She glanced at Randolph, expecting resistance. But he simply said, schedule it. The legal documentation arrived in a leather portfolio, delivered by Sophia Chen, Marcus's former lawyer, who'd apparently decided that continued employment was preferable to being implicated in kidnapping and conspiracy. The papers were complex, but the summary was straightforward. DNA testing confirmed Elena's maternity. The falsified birth certificate issued under Randolph's late wife's name was declared fraudulent. Dr. Michael Harrison's medical license was posthumously revoked after evidence emerged of his role in the illegal adoption scheme. Allan Leggett was officially recognized as the biological son of Elena Brooks and an unnamed father. Randolph had quietly arranged for his own name to be listed as legal guardian and adoptive father, pending Elena's approval. She found him in his study late one night, the papers spread across his desk, a glass of scotch untouched at his elbow. You could have just listed yourself as his father, Elena said from the doorway. No one would question it. Randolph looked up, exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes. I've built my life on lies of omission, Miss Brooks. I won't build my son's future on them. He gestured to the chair across from him. He's yours biologically. I'm asking for the legal right to be his father by choice. Elena sat slowly, processing the weight of what he was offering. You're one of the most powerful men in Chicago. You could have buried the truth, kept the original birth certificate, made me disappear. I could have. Randolph's voice was quiet. I considered it, briefly, in those first hours after the DNA results came back. It would have been cleaner. Safer. He met her eyes. And it would have destroyed the one good thing I've managed to do in 20 years of calculated cruelty. Allan deserves a mother. You deserve your son. I won't take that from either of you to protect my reputation. Elena's throat tightened. What are you asking for, Randolph? Partnership. He leaned back in his chair. I'm not asking you to love me or trust me, or even like me particularly. I'm asking you to co-parent the child we've both chosen to protect. To stay here, where he's safe, where you're both safe. To help me figure out how to be a father instead of just a provider. And if I want to leave? Then you leave, and I'll arrange security for both of you, and Allan will visit on whatever schedule you decide. Randolph's expression didn't change. But I hope you'll stay. Why? Because he laughs now when you sing to him. Because he asks where you are when you're not in the room. Because you dove across a rooftop and caught him when he was falling, and that kind of love doesn't get replicated. His voice dropped. And because I've spent 3 years raising a ghost. I'd like to learn how to raise a child instead. Elena looked at the papers, at the careful legal language that restructured their entire lives, and realized she'd already made her decision days ago. I'll stay, she said quietly. Not because of the security or the estate or any of this. She gestured to the opulent study. I'll stay because he's my son, and he needs stability, and somehow this broken, impossible situation is the safest place for him to heal. Randolph nodded once, something like relief flickering across his features. Then we'll make it work. Winter settled over Chicago with unusual gentleness. Snow fell in soft curtains, transforming the estate's gardens into something from a storybook. Allan pressed his nose against the windows, his vocabulary expanding daily, his questions endless and delightful. Can we build a snowman? Why is snow cold? Do snowflakes have families like us? Elena bundled him in a coat that cost more than her monthly rent used to and took him outside. Randolph appeared 10 minutes later, still wearing his suit but carrying a carrot and a silk scarf that had probably belonged to his late wife. They built the snowman together, Allan directing operations with the authority of a tiny general. Mama, more snow here. Daddy, the eyes are crooked. No, not like that. Like this. Elena caught Randolph's eye over Allan's head and saw the ghost of a smile. He's bossy, Randolph observed. He gets it from both of us, Elena replied without thinking. The words hung in the cold air, an acknowledgement of something neither had said aloud. They were a unit now. Not a traditional family. Not a love story. But something functional and necessary and surprisingly comfortable. That evening, Dr. Chen's words echoed in Elena's mind during their family therapy session. You're building a new kind of family. One based on choice and commitment rather than biology or tradition. That's not weakness. That's evolution. Spring came late, but when it arrived, it transformed the estate's gardens into riots of color. Tulips and crocuses pushed through thawed earth. Trees budded with aggressive optimism. Allan ran through the grass, his laughter echoing off stone walls that had witnessed decades of violence and calculation. Elena watched from a bench near the fountain, a book open but unread in her lap. She'd enrolled in online courses, finishing her degree in early childhood education. Randolph had offered to fund it without expectation of repayment. She'd accepted, understanding now that some gifts weren't transactions. Randolph emerged from the house, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up in a concession to the warming weather. He'd been in fewer meetings lately, delegating more, present more. Learning, as Dr. Chen had suggested, to prioritize differently. He sat beside Elena, not touching, but close enough that she felt his presence like heat. He asked me this morning if we were married, Randolph said without preamble. Elena's breath caught. What did you tell him? The truth. That we're partners raising him together. That family doesn't require marriage certificates. He paused. He seemed satisfied with that answer. And are you? Elena asked. Satisfied. Randolph considered the question, watching Allan chase butterflies through the garden with the focused intensity he'd once brought to criminal enterprises. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined this. Any of this. My life was predictable. Controlled. Lonely, though I didn't recognize it as such. He turned to look at her. You've disrupted everything. And somehow, I'm grateful for it. Elena's pulse quickened. She'd been aware, in recent weeks, of the way Randolph's gaze lingered. The careful distance he maintained. The respect he showed her autonomy. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe never. But it was the foundation of something that could become love, given time and trust and continued choice. I never thanked you, she said quietly. For believing me. For protecting us. For stepping off that roof. I never thanked you for catching him. For teaching him how to speak. For staying when you had every reason to run. Randolph's hand moved slowly, deliberately, giving her time to pull away. His fingers brushed hers, a question rather than a demand. Elena didn't pull away. They sat like that, hands loosely intertwined, watching their son play in gardens built by criminals and blood money but maintained now for entirely different reasons. Mama. Daddy. Allan's voice cut through the spring air. Come see. I found a ladybug. It's red with spots. Come see, come see. He stood in the middle of the lawn, jumping up and down with excitement, his arms spread wide as if he could embrace the entire world. Elena and Randolph rose simultaneously, their hands separating naturally as they walked toward the boy who had brought them together through violence and trauma and the unstoppable force of maternal instinct meeting paternal devotion. Allan grabbed both their hands when they reached him, his small fingers squeezing tight. He looked up at them, his smile brilliant and unguarded, his eyes free of the haunted shadows that had defined his first 3 years. We're a family, he announced with the certainty of a child who'd finally found solid ground. Right. We're a real family? Yes, Elena said, her voice steady and sure. We're a real family. Randolph knelt, bringing himself to Allan's eye level. The most real family, he confirmed. Because we chose each other. Every single day. Allan threw his arms around both of them, a three-way hug that was clumsy and perfect and fragile in all the ways that mattered. That night, after Allan was asleep, Elena stood at her bedroom window overlooking the gardens. The estate that had once felt like a prison now felt like something else. Not quite home. Not yet. But close. A knock at her door. Randolph's voice, quiet. "May I come in?" She turned, nodding. He entered but kept his distance, respecting the boundaries they'd carefully constructed. "I wanted you to know. The last of Marcus's allies have been dealt with. The threats are neutralized. If you wanted to leave, to take Allan somewhere without guards and security protocols, you could. You're safe now." Elena studied his face, reading the subtext beneath the words. He was giving her an out. Permission to leave without guilt or complication. "And if I don't want to leave?" she asked. Something shifted in Randolph's expression. Relief. Hope. Vulnerability he usually kept buried beneath layers of control. "Then I'd spend every day trying to deserve that choice," he said simply. Elena crossed the room slowly, stopping just close enough that the space between them felt charged. "I'm not staying because I'm afraid to leave. I'm staying because I choose this. Broken and complicated as it is." "Broken and complicated," Randolph echoed. "Yes. But also real." "Yes," Elena agreed. "Real." They stood there, two people who'd been thrown together by tragedy and conspiracy, who'd chosen partnership over convenience, who'd built something functional from the wreckage of stolen lives and violent reckonings. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was theirs. 6 months later, Allan Leggett turned 4 years old in a garden filled with children from his new preschool, supervised by security disguised as catering staff. He blew out candles on a cake shaped like a train and opened presents with the unbridled enthusiasm of a child who'd learned that joy wasn't something to fear. Elena watched from the shade, her hand resting unconsciously on her stomach where new life was just beginning to make itself known. Unplanned. Complicated. But somehow right. Randolph appeared beside her, following her gaze to where Allan commanded his friends in an elaborate game involving dinosaurs and construction vehicles. "He's thriving," Randolph observed. "He is," Elena agreed. "We all are." Randolph's hand found hers, the gesture familiar now after months of slowly rebuilt trust. "When Allan asks for a sibling, should I tell him to be patient?" Elena laughed, surprised. "You know, Vincent's team is very thorough. Medical appointments don't go unnoticed." Randolph's thumb traced circles on her palm. "Though I confess, I was hoping you'd tell me yourself. I just found out yesterday." Elena turned to face him. "Are you okay with this?" Randolph considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "A year ago, I'd have calculated risk and logistics. Today, I'm thinking about what color to paint the nursery and whether Allan will be a good big brother." He smiled, rare and genuine. "Yes, Elena. I'm more than okay with this." She leaned into him slightly, their relationship still more partnership than romance but evolving into something deeper with each shared moment. "Good. Because I'm terrified and excited in equal measure." "That sounds like parenthood," Randolph replied. "We'll figure it out. Like we've figured out everything else. Together." "Together," he confirmed. Across the garden, Allan looked up, caught sight of them standing close, and his face split into a grin. He abandoned his game and ran toward them, his friends forgotten in the singular focus children have for their parents. "Mama. Daddy. Come play." They went. Because that's what families did. They showed up. They played. They chose each other every single day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. The empire still existed. Leaner. Quieter. More legitimate with each passing month. But it no longer defined Randolph Leggett. His family did. And in gardens built by violence but maintained by love, that family grew. Not perfect. Not traditional. But absolutely, unquestionably real. Because family isn't determined by blood alone. It's forged in sacrifice and choice. In mothers who leap across rooftops. In fathers who step off edges. In children who find their voices. And in the truth that some bonds, once formed, cannot be broken by lies or violence or the weight of empires. Elena Brooks had lost her son once. She'd found him again. And nothing, not power, not money, not the dangerous legacy of the Leggett name, would ever take him from her again. Because a mother reclaimed is unstoppable. And a family built on truth is unbreakable. Even in the darkness, especially in the darkness, love survives. And sometimes, against all odds, it even thrives.